Thank you, everyone, for coming to tonight's Davenant Fellows Lecture. I see a lot of familiar names of people who have come to a few of these. So I'm guessing a lot of you know how these things are run. These lectures are designed to show off the teaching talents that we have in our Davenant Hall courses, which we're going to begin opening registration for our summer term here in the next few weeks. So if you like what you hear tonight, we would invite you to sign up for some of these classes. So basically how this lecture is going to work is Colin Redemer is going to speak for about 45 minutes on the topic, which you all have heard about. And then we're going to give you maybe 2 to 3 minutes to ask questions. And then we're going to come back and I'm going to read off your questions to Colin. Please put them in the Q&A portion of the Zoom, not in the chat. We're going to be checking the Q&A. We may check the chat somewhat, but we'd prefer if you put it in the designated Q&A section. So with that being said, I'll introduce tonight's speaker. Colin Chan Redemer is the Vice President of the Davenant Institute and teaches in a Great Books program in California. He loves working in the intersection between history, philosophy, literature, and Christianity. He is a member of one church, husband of one wife, father of 3 kids, and walker of 1 basset hound. So with that, Colin, take it away.
Great. Thank you, Michael. And thank you to everyone who's here. Tonight's lecture is Live Not by Dreher Alone. And as many of you are probably aware, Rod Dreher put out a book called Live Not by Lies, which is, again, he's taking that from a lecture or an essay, which was written by Solzhenitsyn called Live Not by Lies. Very short essay. Which hopefully will get sent out to everyone at the end here. You can find it on the Solzhenitsyn Center online by Googling it. And this lecture is intended to be a response to his book. And as I have been reflecting this year, his book stands out, but it primarily stands out for what it highlights, which is the history of the Soviet dissident literature, the writings from both Christians and non-Christians who lived underneath the Soviet Union and wrote and left a record of what it was like living there and what it took to dissent and to resist the goals that the Soviet Union had for them. There's one moment in the past year which stood out to me. I was watching the Super Bowl at my parents' house. And in the midst of the Super Bowl, one of the commercials that came on was a commercial for like an Amazon Echo or something along those lines. And there was a woman in it who's listening to it read kind of a romance novel to her. And she said, this couldn't be more perfect. And then as she reflected, suddenly she realized this could be more perfect. And she imagined that Amazon Echo reading to her through an embodied man who she was taking a bath with. We could read this commercial as simply a piece of literature, an idle joke, a fantasy. But I think there's something implicit in that, and it wasn't the only advertisement that hinted at this in the Super Bowl. And you, once I think you can see this, you can see it everywhere. What it's hinting at is that there's some way we would like reality to be, which it isn't currently. I think what it's hinting at is something which is all over our culture at the moment, which is transhumanism. The idea that what we would really like is to make humanity other than it is in a fundamental sense. Transhumanism has a long pedigree as a word. It was first coined by Dante Alighieri in the Divine Comedy. As Dante, the poet, is writing about Dante the pilgrim going up into heaven, he has to transhumanize in order to get to God. This usage of transhumanize is actually quite Christian. Christianity has always recognized that there's something intrinsic in us as humans which longs to be more than what we are. We are not satisfied in the form that we find ourselves. There's a holy dissatisfaction with reality. And so the concept and doctrine of theosis is this idea that we are going to be united with God. We are going to be with God and become like God in some way that we currently aren't. And in Scripture, we see this in the concept that we're going to be united to Christ in some way. So Christianity has long recognized that this is a thing inside of us, but we're not the only people who've tried to figure out what to do with this longing. So we can see, for example, in Aristotle, him wrestling in the Nicomachean Ethics with the concept that, should I want my friend to be like a god? Would the happiness that I can have as a human really be the best happiness? Or should I want the happiness that a god has? And Aristotle doesn't quite know what to do with it, but he knows that this is a real problem he's got to deal with. Well, I think that the current wrestling that we're dealing with is actually quite distinct from this concept of theosis. The current moment that we're in is actually much more interested in whether we, here and now, can effectuate our own transhumanization. See, the concept of theosis is that God's going to come from outside of us and transform us. He's going to do something to us. He's going to save us. It's connected to his grace, what his plan is for each of us and for the world. But the ideas that are currently floating around seem quite different from that. So, for example, we have the idea that maybe we can stave off death, maybe forever. We have the idea that we can edit our own genetic material to make ourselves smarter, faster, stronger, better. We are experimenting with these things. If that's not going to work, if maybe biology is not the solution, and we're not going to be able to get there biologically, and if that's the case, then perhaps we are going to upload our consciousness onto a computer, and we will transcend out of our body, which is sort of a cage that we're trapped inside of that we're not happy with. Or, maybe that's a little too, science fiction for you. And so let's just find a way to augment our bodies through technology so that they can keep going long after they would naturally not be able to carry themselves around. This conception of transhumanism is an idea that we're going to find some way through our own means to transform ourselves and fill our ultimate longings. These ideas, I would submit, have their roots in several modern thinkers who attempt to do fundamental re-understandings and transformations of what it means to be human through their theories about what we are. So, for example, we have Rousseau, who wants to re-understand what we are as humans rather than us being the rational beings and the rational animals and the political animals. Wants to argue that what it means to be human is we're really just animals, except we get to choose. That's the only distinction. It's not rational. Hegel, we could say, maybe takes this a step farther. Hegel saying that what it is to be human is ultimately for us to be in a historical process of confronting these problems that make us human, which ultimately are going to result in us resolving that by transcending our own nature and becoming something unrecognizable to what we are right now. We can read him, even more clearly through modern thinker Alexander Koyev, who's one of the founders, intellectual founders of the European Union, and of course Karl Marx is going to feature prominently in tonight's lecture. Marx following on Hegel and arguing that through this dialectical process, we're going to transcend ourselves and we're going to create the Soviet man or the communist man, the new man. There's a new humanity which will emerge on the other side of the material social relationships which we currently find ourselves in. We won't even be able to understand what that new man is like until we get there. So if those are the thinkers who are sort of advocating for this as a project that we should embark upon politically, philosophically, socially, we can also see these theories operating in the thinkers who would resist these people. So, for example, I would exhort you to do a comparative reading of the works of Solzhenitsyn, who is going to argue that in Live Not by Lies, a very short essay, argues that, in fact, precisely what is going on. Wait until the last paragraph, and I'll read it to you. In the last paragraph, he says, if we shrink away from our duty to resist what's going on in the Soviet Union, then let us cease complaining that someone does not let us draw breath. We do it to ourselves. Let us then cower and hunker down while our comrades, the biologists, bring closer the day when our thoughts can be read and our genes altered. So Solzhenitsyn's aware that there's this transhumanist drive which is intrinsic in the Soviet Union, and he thinks this is bad. C.S. Lewis, similarly, we could say, in The Abolition of Man, makes his most strident defense of what it is to be human, and similarly argues that if we fail at this defense, the end result is going to be an attempt to create something transhuman. Similarly, we have Vaclav Havel, not a particularly Christian man, but he argues that yes, it's what they want to create is the Soviet man. They want to create this new human who's this bureaucratic man. It's a completely different understanding of the self, a different set of social relationships, and that's the temporary phase before we get to the place where we transcend our humanity. And finally, Milosh, who is a Soviet dissident who defects to the West and writes about the people that he sees who have stayed in the West and what happened to them. How did they get compromised? And each of those people is aware at some point in the end that there is a plan to change and transform who you are inside the Soviet Union, which is operating whether you want it to or not, and which, if you do not get on board and move along with that plan, will eventually get you out of the way. Tonight, I want to argue that without a proper philosophical grasp of and embrace of human nature, there is no hope of resistance. There is no hope of resistance. I'll say that one more time. Without a proper philosophical grasp and embrace of human nature, there is no resistance. Obviously, this talk is engaging with Rod Dreher. And in one sense, I want to say that Rod Dreher's book, Live Not by Lies, is kind of too late for what it claims. So if you've read the book, Rod Dreher makes the claim that we are entering a moment much like when the Soviet Union came into being in 1918 here in the West. And that argument is based on, for example, friends of his who grew up in the Soviet Union and who are terrified of what they're seeing happening in the United States. I'm sympathetic with this, in part because a good friend of mine who grew up in the Soviet Union recently moved back to Eastern Europe with her husband, who was born and raised in America, in part because of the concern that she has looking around the world as it's currently constituted in America. But I say that Dreher is too late, and I say it for this reason. For Dreher's argument to make sense that we're just about to enter this 1918 moment in America, you have to believe that we weren't already there. And if you go back and you read Solzhenitsyn and Vaclav Havel and Milosh and other Soviet dissidents, one thing which is common throughout all of them is that without fail, they each make the argument that the West is already there or already headed there. You know, in the 1970s, you have Vaclav Havel saying that a consumerist, market-based society is ultimately headed in the same direction as the communist society. It's got the same end result in mind. It's simply attempting to get there by other means. You have Solzhenitsyn, who in his Harvard address says that he cannot advocate the West as a better option because it isn't prepared for what it's going through. He says there that I highly recommend that piece. He says, If in the East, meaning the Soviet Union, there's absolute lawlessness, right? The secret police can do whatever they want. In the West, all you have is the written law. There's no sense that the written law actually means anything. In other words, positive law formulations, this idea that, well, we have a law that says this, if that's all you have, just a piece of paper that says something, it can't actually help you. So Solzhenitsyn says, you're already headed there. You're already in the midst of this historical flow, which is heading to a bad place. And Miloš similarly says that the only thing that's distinct, and this is from his book The Captive Mind, which I would highly recommend you read. In The Captive Mind says the only thing that makes the West freer is that it still has juridical defense. Now that's not nothing, and he did defect and go to the West. But in his mind, the West is operating in a fundamentally different vein. It's a different world than it was before the modern period. So I for this reason, because I've closely studied these folks, I would say Dreher is too late. It's too late to go around telling people, hey, we might be in a 1918 moment. Our society is about to fundamentally change. Maybe our society is about to fundamentally change, but it's not about to change in the way that things changed in 1918. In fact, the things that the Soviet dissidents can teach us, they were actually trying to teach us at the time that they were writing. We should go back to them to realize the various options and opportunities which we have missed as a people and culture for the last 50 to 70 years. Because it's too late, because I think Rod Dreher is too late, it's also, there's no need to panic. So I think one thing which can happen as one reads Rod Dreher is there's a sense that, oh my gosh, the whole world's falling apart. It's about to be over. It's time to panic. If you actually read the Soviet dissidents, you realize that they're living through it, and they're still writing. They're still writing. They're still getting together. It's difficult, but they're actually doing it in the midst of the Soviet Union. If that's the case, and if we believe them that we have actually been living in a somehow fundamentally transformed society for the last several decades, then there's no reason to panic all of a sudden. In fact, if we feel the need to panic, all that means is that we're starting to see something which has probably already been there for a while. That's something that's probably already been there for a while. So what is it that's already been there for a while? What's already been there is a simply materialist understanding of what we are as humans. This is one of the things that the Soviet Union insisted on. They loathed metaphysics, which claimed that there was, for example, an immaterial human soul. Everything was going to be understood in the sense of what we are as biological material creatures. And that being the fundamental threat of the Soviet Union, we can actually see as quite, we could be quite comfortable with that in a consumerist society. There's nothing intrinsic inside of a consumerist market-based society which is opposed to the idea of thinking about humans as mere matter. Because of that, we can see the direction and the ways in which the Soviet dissidents resisted are available to us. They're available to us. Maybe there's another category of people who read Dreher or who are listening to this lecture, and those are folks who disbelieve Rod Dreher's warning or disbelieve the Soviet dissidents' warnings about the directions that Western society is already headed in. I would submit that most people who disbelieve these warnings disbelieve them because they misunderstand the meaning of the word totalitarianism. You see, when we in the West hear the term totalitarianism in the modern West, we tend to think of totalitarianism in terms of a dictatorship, right? Stalin. There's one person who's in charge of everything. But I want us to be able to distinguish that there are dictatorships which don't seem particularly totalitarian. You can have more or less freedom inside of a dictatorship. That there are such things as, one person rule, which exists to allow a certain amount of freedom. We can think of various monarchies throughout history that have managed this. So dictatorship is not quite the same thing as totalitarianism, though we often find them going together. The other thing we might think of when we talk about totalitarianism is violence. And so again, we think of Stalin as the ultimate totalitarian, and he certainly was a totalitarian. And violence, therefore, is the thing we think of. And so we look around our society and we say, well, there's not a lot of violence, or not a lot of state, enforced violence on the people. And therefore, we must not be in a totalitarian phase. So again, if we think of, and yet we can think of very violent societies, which are not totalitarian per se. Societies which are, in the midst of genuine civic strife can be quite violent without being totalitarian. So what do we mean by totalitarian? And similarly, we're going to try to imagine a totalitarian society which is not violent and which is not ultimately a dictatorship. Is that possible? That's what we would have to be convinced of to believe the Soviet dissidents. Well, Rod Dreher coins the term, I believe he coins it in his book, soft totalitarianism, that we're living in soft totalitarianism. There's another thinker online who I encourage you to read and engage with, James Poulos, who Rod Dreher read, which helped him come up with his concept of soft totalitarianism. And James Poulos has a way with words, and he calls this the pink police state. I will, because we're narrowly trying to engage with the Soviet dissidents themselves, right? Rather than just reading Rod Dreher, I want us to be able to go through Rod Dreher and go back and look at the dissidents themselves. What Vaclav Havel says is, really we shouldn't think about totalitarianism because it talks about violence and dictatorship. We should talk about post-totalitarianism. That's his term. So what is totalitarianism? Totalitarianism is not dictatorship and it's not violence. Totalitarianism is the political interest in the transformation of the entire human. Totalitarianism, properly understood, right? It's totalizing. It's the transformation of the whole person and of the entire population. This is why, again, at the end of Solzhenitsyn's work, Live Not by Lies, he says that if we fail at our task and we just sit by, all we're doing is waiting for the day when the biologists bring closer the government's ability to read our thoughts and alter our genes. That's totalitarianism. Totalitarianism is political transhumanism. It's the sense that what we really want to do is reach out and transform the population so that the population is as we want it to be. And in Solzhenitsyn's words, violence and Vaclav Havel, they would both agree, violence is simply a tool. It's one tool in the toolkit of the totalitarian regime. So, for example, in Solzhenitsyn's words, when the regime decides that violence isn't going to be useful anymore, they pick up their second tool, which is lies. So if force isn't going to work, we will use fraud. And by the time he's writing, of course, the great purges of Stalin are over, and it's a relatively free society. He says, I can write whatever I want. What I'm primarily risking is my ability to get a good job, my ability to have social standing, my ability to provide luxurious food for my family. And so if I fail to speak the truth to people because I'm afraid of losing my social standing, I'm afraid I won't have enough money to keep the heat on, I'm afraid that I won't be able to buy luxurious food, then I should admit to myself that I am only a cow and that I can be bought for warmth and fodder. The apathy, in Vaclav Havel's words, the apathy of a consumer society is ripe for totalitarianism. By the time Vaclav Havel's writing, again, there's rarely like a genuine dictator. Most things are being done by committees inside of the Soviet Union, and so again, there's no dictatorship, there's no real violence. But Vaclav Havel is going to have a hard time getting his work published if he comes out in opposition to the regime. And so this is the form in which we see the totalitarianism functioning. It's an attempt to get everyone to do as the government wants them to do by means of force or fraud. And the concept "live not by lies," which is Solzhenitsyn's words, is mirrored in Vaclav Havel's words that we need to live in the truth. This concept that the way to resist the totalitarianism, the soft totalitarianism, the post-totalitarian age, is to somehow cling to the truth and not compromise the truth. Why is that so powerful? It's so powerful because it eats away at that fundamental misunderstanding of what the human is. The human is the rational animal, meaning for me to know and speak the truth, for me to engage with the logos, is for me to be most human. It's what it means for me to have a proper philosophical grasp of what it is for me to be a human, and for me to embrace that and hold it close to myself. Therefore, it is also one of the most dangerous things you can do in the midst of a totalitarian regime, is to simply speak the truth. That's why you have to be ostracized. That's why you have to be kicked out of the meeting, because we cannot tolerate that person. You see, one of the things that all these thinkers know is that to speak the truth anywhere where the lie rules is to pop the balloon. It's to break through the facade of reality that's inside of everyone's social surround. The moment, in Vaclav Havel's words, that someone takes the sign out of the window, which says "Workers of the world unite," which is kind of the Soviet slogan of the day. The moment one person decides, "I'm just not going to take the sign, and I'm not going to put the sign in my window," it pops the bubble of everyone thinking that everyone really wants this, everyone really means this. These signs don't mean what we think they do. Our words don't mean what we think they do. So I want to pivot slightly and think a bit about how meditating on this could help the American church in our current moment. We're all aware that Scripture tells us the gates of hell will not prevail over Christ's church, and that's true. But Scripture makes no guarantee of any given national church. There's no guarantee that the American church will survive. So in the midst of that, we have to, as people, as Christians in the American church, and I'm aware that there's people who are tuning in and who are going to be seeing this video in various other countries and contexts. So please apply this as it is meet and right for you to do in your context. What is it that Christians need to do given the moment that we're in? Well, I want to raise a historical point, which is I think evangelicalism in America was founded on niceness. There's a way in which what it means for us, if for those of us who identify as evangelicals, what it means for us to be evangelicals is that we're going to be nice. And evangelicalism came about as kind of a big umbrella term to try to get a bunch of Christians in one room together. And it was founded in an era when most people in the West thought being a Christian was kind of a net good. Even if they weren't Christians themselves, being a Christian meant at the very least, I don't want to be seen to be cheating you out of money. Maybe Christian in America, when the term evangelicalism was coined, meant something a bit like what we mean by Mormon. If someone moves in next door and they say they're a Mormon, I'm not a Mormon. I don't particularly like Mormons, but I don't particularly dislike Mormons. They say they're Mormon, and I simply think, I know they won't want to be on camera stealing my car. Christian meant something like that when evangelicalism came into being. It has kind of the connotation with niceness, and we've maintained that in part because we believed this is an outreach strategy. We're going to be nice. We're going to, be good neighbors. We're going to bring folks in. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But while that's been our history, things have changed around us. At some point, and I'm borrowing from Aaron Wrenn here, who's another Christian thinker. You can find him on the internet talking about this. At some point, things shifted, maybe around the 90s, early 90s, where being a Christian was no longer a net good, a net positive thing. It was more like a neutral thing. You're a vegan, I'm a Christian. And maybe if Billy Graham is really the image of the early evangelicalism, it's a net good strategy. Tim Keller is it's kind of a neutral thing, everyone's got their own bag. I want to say, it seems clear if we're not already there, we are rapidly heading into a season inside the American church where it's a net negative. Now, that is not to say that the goal of Christians should not be to be nice. It's certainly not to say that the goal should be to be mean. However, I think recognizing that that's kind of just, those are the clothes that we wear, that's kind of the way that we've been comfortable, can help us to understand that no longer is working as a way of being the church in the world. Niceness can be quite easily compromised. Milosz, in The Captive Mind, writes extensively about the ways in which the Soviet Union had very highly tuned and calculated ways of compromising all the Christians who were living in the places where the Soviet Union was taking over the country. So, for example, when the Soviet Union came into a country, they would not shut down the churches immediately. He actually says, and when I first read this, I was kind of like shaking, and I dropped the book because it was like too much. But he says the Soviet Union would never just shut all the churches down, because the Christians wouldn't put up with it, which, given the last year, is kind of a shocking statement. Niceness is easily compromised. When the Soviets came in, they would actually try to recruit Christians to write for their publications. But of course, they would be selective about who those Christians were, and they would be selective about what those Christians could say. And of course, they would not be very selective at first. They'd be relatively open, but over time, they would narrow and narrow and further narrow what could be said and who was going to be allowed to speak. And the goal of this was to create, kind of separate out the people who wanted to be compliant, the people who wanted to be nice and be a part of the respectable regime, from the people who didn't want to be nice, who were not interested in being respectable. And as that separation took place, eventually also the goal was that you wanted the Orthodox practicing Christians who genuinely had faith to be considered rubes, to be considered backwards, to be considered unscientific, to be considered uneducated, and maybe uneducable. There's something wrong with them. Meanwhile, you always wanted to make sure there was some space for people to be Christian, provided they had compromised themselves somehow. The Soviet regime, was very interested in people compromising themselves, being compromised. So Milosz, right? What he's talking about here is the ways in which niceness is actually easily compromised. When your interest is in getting along, primarily, first and foremost, that's more easily compromised than someone who's interested in, let's say, the truth. If most of the last 100 years, or at least 80 years of American Christianity is kind of founded on this concept that we want to be nice, I would say the first thing to ask of the church is to recognize the signs of the times that we are in and refound the church on truth. We have to rethink what it is to be Christians in the world and focus that on saying we are going to speak the truth, or at the very least, we won't speak and live a lie. I think there's a similar phenomenon to what Miloš talks about, which I'm hoping in at least this one example we can see some of what I've said earlier, that the Soviet dissidents said this is already taking place. The example is the Chinese church and the American church. The average American thinks of the Chinese church more or less the way that the Chinese church was in the 1950s, that there's an underground church, there's very few Christians there, they're working very hard behind the scenes to evangelize and spread the gospel message, and the government is repressing them and is hunting them and trying to stop and stamp out the gospel. Meanwhile, we tend to think of America as a free country where we have religious freedom and there's freedom of expression and the churches can do as they wish. I think that is the wrong paradigm for understanding either the Chinese church or the American church. And I think reframing the paradigm and understanding the way things are actually operating at the moment can help open our eyes to what the Soviet dissidents were saying. It is not the 1950s Chinese church, and it's not the 1950s American church. Rather, what we currently have is the Chi-American church. And the Chi-American church operates both in China and in America. And in both places, if we look at China right now, there is an official church, which is government sanctioned. And in fact, you know, in the Roman Catholic world, the Chinese government gets to pick the supreme bishops of the Roman Catholic Church over there. And you know, the papacy is trying to figure out how to relate to that. But even for Protestant churches, there's official churches. And then there's an underground church. If you're in the official church, you get paid pretty well. Maybe you get a column in the newspaper. You say things as long as they are government approved, as long as they fit with what the regime says. If you're in the underground church, maybe you have some thoughts which are a little bit more seditious. You are teaching some aspects of Christianity which the government would like to tamp down. You are not welcome at everyone's house because of who you are and who you associate with. I want to argue that the current American church is more similar to the Chinese American, to the current Chinese church than we are probably comfortable thinking. If you're a Christian and you say the right things, you have the right opinions, you support the regime in all the right ways, you can have a column in a leading newspaper. You can be invited to the right parties. You can keep your job. If you're a Christian and you say the wrong things, either because you don't know what to say or because you just won't say it, you could suffer genuine consequences. You could suffer consequences just socially. People might not want to hang out with you. You could suffer consequences for losing your job. You are not going to be invited to the right parties. You are going to be looked down upon. I say this simply to help clarify the situation as it currently stands. In the midst of that situation, I think niceness is actually dangerous. This is not to say that there are not good Christians in the official Chinese church or in the regime-supporting American church. I believe there are. And I believe many folks are called to it as an aspect of their vocation. But whether you are in that set or whether you are in the underground church, to remain a faithful Christian, you actually must refound your faith and refound your engagement with Christ, His Word, the church, and the world on truth. Above all, you must be prepared with courage to suffer, if necessary. And we must be shrewd as snakes. We must be aware of the situation that we are in and be prepared to make shrewd judgments, even while we are guileless as doves. And finally, we must find ways to build trustworthy networks so that Christians can communicate with one another. One of the major differences between the dissidents and the situation that contemporary dissidents of the American regime are in is actually that we are in a much worse position than the dissidents were in the 1970s in the Soviet Union. They at least had publishing houses. They had underground presses and networks of salons and known people that they could go and talk to. We seem to be single-handedly unprepared for a situation in which we might need to communicate over some medium which is not going to be watched by corporations and government entities whose agenda we do not know about in any explicit fashion and have no control of or accountability. They have no accountability to us. So I'll end with this. In the midst of our transhumanist moment, we have to once again join hands and lock arms with all people of goodwill who are willing to engage in a philosophical understanding of humans as rational animals seeking truth. We have to embrace and learn to love human nature as it is and tell the world about why it is good to be a human, what is good in our nature, and why it is that there is a God who would die to rescue us. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Colin. That was great.
Very welcome.
Let's take about 2 or 3 minutes so that anybody who has a question can begin thinking about it and typing it in the Q&A section. So it's 7:44. So at about 7:47, we'll start with the questions. So we've already got 3 or 4. In the meantime, here in the chat, I am posting a link to the Solzhenitsyn essay, Live Not by Lies. And to those of you who are not yet with us, but will be watching on YouTube, you can find a link to that essay in the YouTube description.
Yeah, I was tempted, Michael, to just take 10 of my minutes and read it to everyone. It's that good. It's one of the most excellent things he ever wrote. So
yeah, I started to scan it after I found it, and I've got it's called the Solzhenitsyn Reader. It's published by ISI Books.
Oh,
it's
great.
Selected writings from 1947 to 2005. So I wonder if it's in there. I haven't looked much at Solzhenitsyn. I hear the name, but I haven't read much of him.
I can't recommend him highly enough.
We're up to 6 questions now. Okay. Well, let's go ahead and start, and people can keep over. So questions are just flooding in now. So I have never asked a question in one of these things, so I'm going to invoke moderator privilege and ask the first question.
Sure.
So at the very beginning, you talked about Aristotle. So Aristotle, he talks about man as a political animal, where the telos of man is to be in a community. And if you don't believe that you should belong in community, then you're either a god or a beast. So can you talk about the difference between what Aristotle thinks, where community is the telos, and what some of these later authors think, where we're trying to push the telos even further than what it should be?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, that's right. Aristotle's famous line is that anyone who chooses not to live as a human is either going, if you're not living in a city, right, you're either going to end up living as a god or a beast, because you can't live as a human alone out in the wilderness. And I would say it's not that the telos, the purpose or the goal, right? That's telos, the Greek term of man, is to live in the city.
The telos of man is eudaimonia, it's happiness, or we could translate that as blessedness, but he doesn't have a religious understanding of it. But happiness maybe is too weak of a term. So something like happiness or blessedness. So that's our telos. But of course, our telos of happiness, the ultimate happiness is, okay, so I need some shoes and, a t-shirt, and then I need a cheeseburger and, some water and a roof over my head, and then I'm pretty good. But you, in the end, you still need someone to live. And then maybe I need a little money so I can, hand out some cash and, but I need people to talk to. I need somebody to be generous towards. So community, the political community arises naturally. It's not something that's super added on top of us. So this is a major distinction between, for example, Aristotle and thinkers like Hobbes, who are going to say that by nature we are, at war with one another. No. To Aristotle, we're naturally in a community together, and peace is our nature. That's the goal. That's what we're aiming towards. We don't want to kill each other. The killing of one another is incidental, accidental. It's not good. And so the two famous phrases Aristotle has is that man is the rational animal, and man is the political animal. And those are actually two sides of the same coin. So because what it is for us to think is for us to talk it out, right? The logos is the word. It's for us. And so if I'm going to talk it out, I need someone to talk with. And so just what we're doing right here is a major part of that. The rational and political animal is the telos. I actually got lost talking about Aristotle, as always happens with me. How is this? I forget how you had a question. It was connected to the Soviet Union, right? Or the dissidents.
I was asking about the difference between the telos being community and pushing past the telos.
Right. Okay. So thank you for the reminder. So Aristotle makes it clear that he's aware that humans have a desire to become like gods, but he's existing inside of a culture which has no conception of how one would go about doing that. So the closest you can get is to be, for example, a philosopher or something along those lines. You can sort of grasp the whole mentally, but you can never actually get outside of yourself and become a god. And so because of that, his sort of compromise solution is, so we just have to focus on getting what happiness is available to humans. So that would be what I would call the virtuous pagan option. He's not a Christian. It's unclear that he would have been a Christian if he met Paul or something and had the gospel explained to him. But he's aware that that's what he wants. He just can't figure out how to get it. And so he's got enough what I would call philosophical moderation to say, we're not going to try to, with our own power, steal godlike power unto ourselves in a material sense, because there's real goods in being human. And he can articulate what those are and advocate for why we would want to pursue those. The modern thinkers, though, would reject that option and say, no, we should just try to go get. We should try to become, these godlike beings and get outside of ourselves by our own material powers.
Okay. Let's move on to another question. We've got a bunch of questions. This isn't our largest audience, but you can get an award for the most engaged audience. So let's see. Someone has asked.
As long as I'm getting awards, Michael. As long as I'm getting awards.
Is the poetic desire to escape humanity, transhumanism a la Dante, an imaginative escape from reality? In that way, it seems counter-religious and anti-reality.
Yeah, interesting question. So obviously, it depends on how we want to read Dante. So Dante could be... Anyway, I can't get into how we're going to read Dante in this lecture. Let's just say this. At least one thing Dante is gesturing towards is a genuine Christian understanding of humanity as needing to somehow be transformed in order to receive what God has for us. And so when Dante is using the term transhumanize, he's talking about the poet Dante attempting to grow up into the being that could actually be in the presence of God in heaven. And so I would say, I would read that as
or at least that reading that I'm giving you, connects him much more closely to the Christian concept of theosis, which is the perfectly acceptable doctrine for what to do with these desires to get outside of ourselves.
That's a very good question, a very good answer. Let's see, Dr. Eric Enlow asks, did the Soviet dissidents act politically? Were they praiseworthy because they contributed to the overthrow of oppressive regimes, or for other reasons? I.e., does emulating them have a political lesson or another?
Did the Soviet dissidents act politically? Were they praiseworthy because they contributed to the overthrow of oppressive regimes, or for the? I would say, so does emulating them have a political lesson? Okay, yeah. Certainly, many of the dissidents in the Soviet Union were people who politically acted in order to change the situation that they found themselves in. However, I think if we focus on the political actions that they were engaged in, we will misunderstand what lessons they have for us for two reasons. One is that the political actions which are necessary and good in any given time are contingent on the situation we find ourselves in. And so we can't necessarily take what the Soviet dissidents did to oppose the tyrannical regimes that they were in as just one-to-one, that's a good political action, we should do that. Because if it's a good political action, it's only obviously good in that situation. We would have to know if we're in that situation. So the thing that I would point us towards is that in as much as they're good because the dissidents were engaged in a genuine philosophical inquiry into the nature of political things and the nature of humanity in relationship to their political community. And that philosophical investigation of what they were as people and what their community was and the situation they were in is what led them to the conclusions about what was to be done in as much as they got those conclusions right. So emulating them would first and foremost not be to take political action that they took. Rather, the first step is to go back and recognize we have to do a fundamental rethink about who we are in the situation we find ourselves in. That will lead us to whatever actions are necessary, if that makes sense. The contemplative life always has to precede the active life, would be another way of saying what I just said in shorthand.
Okay. So someone asks, how would you envision our interaction with other minorities in this situation? For example, Muslims, who are often grouped with the left, even though they share many things in common with Christians, like sexual ethics.
Yeah. When I think about that question, I think about a student of mine who I was teaching, who wears the full, I don't remember if it's a hijab or a burqa or what, but quite covered, stands out in the campus that I'm on. And she's aware that she gets treated with kid gloves by the community that is around her. And yet is being treated that way only because they do not understand her. So once again, I would say that in response to this, any and all comers who are interested in the genuine philosophical investigation of the nature of humanity, and who are interested in embracing an understanding of humanity as somehow containing a good which is worthy of preserving, both individually in my life and politically in the community around us, ought to be considered a fellow traveler, be they Muslim, Jew, Hindu, or pagan. And those would be folks that I would be interested in attempting to have a conversation with, which could result in shared action.
Good. That was a difficult question. So let's go to a simple one. Could you recommend a beginner's reading list of sorts to someone who's new to the Soviet dissidents?
Yeah, and we'll put this in the YouTube notes too, but Live Not by Lies, the Harvard Address by Solzhenitsyn. I would start with those two. And then I've got it right here, The Power of the Powerless by Vaclav Havel, fantastic book. The Captive Mind by Milosh. And then once you've mastered that stuff, you can move on to some heftier stuff. But that's quite a bit of reading. So those would be some places to begin. But really, I would start with Live Not by Lies. It is a very short piece, and read it. In my initial thinking about writing this lecture, I was considering just doing a comparative reading of The Abolition of Man and Live Not by Lies. Abolition of Man by C.S. Lewis, Live Not by Lies by Solzhenitsyn, because I think when you read them in parallel with one another, you realize that Lewis is aware of precisely what Solzhenitsyn has been saying, which is that this is going on in the West too. It's got a particular expression in the Soviet Union, but the problems of the Soviet Union are actually operative in the intellectual roots of how Western societies are functioning at the moment. So those would be the places I would go. Maybe I'll throw one more in there. I think it's In the First Circle by Solzhenitsyn is the much heftier novel, which I really like. There's 5 chapters in it written from Stalin's perspective. So I would encourage folks to read that. It's very insightful reading and getting into the mind of the Soviet Union.
That's very good. And someone has written to tell us that Live Not by Lies is in the Solzhenitsyn Reader. There's a very nice anthology of Solzhenitsyn's writings published by ISI Press called the Solzhenitsyn Reader.
Great.
Which I know for a fact also has the Harvard Address.
Oh, yeah, I assume.
So let's see. Someone else says, especially in light of Scripture's words on the needs to submit to authorities, what is the domain of a government's authority, not just in the theological sphere of the church, but in practical aspects of church operation?
That's a good question. What is the sphere of the government's authority in our practical lives? I will have to say I do not know the answer to that question. However, I am confident that should one of competent mind, of sound mind, and should one in their community of believers come to believe that the Soviet Union, or not the Soviet Union, just the political community you live in, is in violation of God's teaching and the injunctions that have been placed upon the church, it is clear that one has an obligation to take political action which would be in violation of the civil authority. The tricky place is going to always be when and where is such a violation occurring, and what is prudent action in response to it. And those are going to be 2 questions which I think are hotly contested in any community that finds itself asking precisely the question that I'm being asked. So that's kind of like a non-answer, so I apologize for that one. But
let's see. In your opinion, how have Christians today already crossed the line from reasoning prudentially to rationalization, as described on page 108 in Dreher's book? How can Christians speak for the church in contemporary society without being combative? Is it possible to speak for the truth without being considered unbiblically divisive?
Yeah. So I would this is a great question because it's citing Dreher where it should be citing Milosh or Vaclav Havel, and I would encourage particularly everyone who read Rod Dreher needs to go read the reading list that I just gave you for the Dissidents, kind of the dissident intro literature book. I'll just add this. Again, one of the reasons I came up with the lecture is I love Rod Dreher. I've read 3 of his books, and each one of his books that I've read, it's been kind of a journalistic gloss on some great book. And so, he's got this one, which is kind of a journalistic gloss on a bunch of great literature from the Soviet Union. Obviously, the Benedict Option, which is a gloss on After Virtue. And then he's got another book, which was my favorite of Dreher's 3 books that I read, on Dante, actually. And so it's him kind of telling his personal story while reading Dante. And in each case, when I read it, I thought, this is fine. I mean, it's good, but I know, and I'm sure he would agree with me. And I've tried, maybe we'll get him to tweet this out, that he would agree with me, that everyone who read these books should probably go back and read the original, right? I mean, that's their primary value, is in keeping these original texts in our minds. So again, anonymous attendee, I'm exhorting you to go read Milosh on Ketman or Havel on how to speak truth without being combative. I really like the concept of living not by lies. Yes, if we have lived under the umbrella of niceness, and we recognize that niceness is no longer our friend because it compromises us, there is a bad tendency to think that meanness is the right move, and that's not true. What's the right move then? The right move is the truth. And the right move is shrewdness. You don't have to speak all of the truth all of the time. You do have to speak the truth when you are prompted, if and when you are prompted by the Spirit, and if and when you are asked some direct question. But you would be shocked how often that doesn't happen in most of our lives. So I think there's ample space for the church to publicly speak the truth, engage in the world, care for people, all of the things which I know many faithful churches are trying to do all the time. And internally, speak the truth in the most fulsome way possible to help bolster people's understanding of who they are and what's going on in the world. And then when the rubber's meeting the road and you're out in the world talking to folks in the kind of soft totalitarian reality that you find yourself in, to be shrewd, to be selective, to speak the truth in love, when asked, when necessary, when prompted by the Holy Spirit, and when not doing that, simply not lying. Simply not lying can get you quite a long way there. And so, for example, Solzhenitsyn advises not showing up for meetings where you're going to be asked to participate in lies. He's just like, call in sick. And I think that's the sort of intelligent, shrewd move, which could be used to try to thread that needle of not being divisive and not trying to be a martyr. We're not trying, I don't want anyone to try to get themselves martyred or into trouble. And yet, by simply not showing up for a meeting, what you're really doing is saying, I'm not going to participate in that meeting. That's not a meeting I'm interested in participating in. But it gives you the space to kind of stay in that organization, stay in that space, and be able to speak truthfully about all sorts of other things. Because I think one thing that's worth saying is, I'm not convinced that the Transhumanist project can actually work on its own terms. And so because of that, there is vast swaths of overlap between yourself and the strangest person who you can imagine, like across the political aisle from you, and identifying those vast swaths of similarity where possible, and engaging in fruitful and careful conversation, and attempting to communicate care, I think really can produce fruit in ways that might be surprising to us. Not saying it's not difficult. It's very difficult, but I think it can be done.
Someone else asks, isn't the essential Christian belief that humankind is fallen and therefore the only way for humans to find dignity, life, and true truth is in Jesus Christ? See Romans 5. What is our center?
Yeah. Well, I appreciate the question. I think it was Brian. Yeah, Brian. It is the essential Christian belief. So the core of our faith is that Jesus Christ is the truth. I was actually recently on an airplane flying back from Middle America and to where I live on the West Coast, and they saw what I was reading, and it was clear that this person and I don't share a lot in common from just a few quick sentences. I'll let you interpret that as you will. And eventually got to, talking about who are you? What's your, and it found out I was a philosophy professor. And they asked me, sort of towards the end of the conversation, half jokingly, well, this is an obnoxious question, but what's the truth, philosophy professor? And of course, as a Christian, the answer that I gave was Jesus Christ is the truth. And then I attempted to try to explain how I came to that conclusion in ways which would make sense to this person right in front of me. Okay. That said, the book of Scripture, the revelation of God, which tells us ultimately that Jesus Christ is the true truth, to use your words, is not the only revelation which God gives us, because the book of nature is also available. And in fact, as Paul says in Romans, is available to all, right? The sun shines on the righteous and the wicked alike. So there is access to truth available to non-Christians. And this is also part of the good news. There are things that they can know and which we can know along with them. As mere humans who are thinking things made in the image of God, desirous of truth but unable to quench our longing for it, and so the world being filled with those things, the whole creation being filled with those things, I think it's when I talk, for example, about how one solution is to really begin the philosophical project of grasping and embracing a proper understanding of human nature. That is one of those things which is not fully accessible without understanding who Jesus Christ is and what he means for humanity and for me personally. But we can at least, get some of the way down the road, even if we can't get all the way to the holy city, as it were. So.
See. So, someone else asks, what current writers would you consider dissidents of the American regime?
Yeah. Well, I'll once again say that I advocate for reading anything written by James Poulos, which includes he's got a book on Tocqueville in America, and he writes pretty extensively all over the internet, and I think is one of the most perceptive observers of what's going on in the United States at the moment, which is both, his writing is yes, it's about politics and philosophy, but a lot of it is about technology and recognizing the effect that the end of the televisual surround and the rise of the digital culture we are in is having on us. So he would certainly be somebody who I think is a dissident, who is also absolutely worth reading. I guess if I had to throw another name, you guys are going to get me canceled tonight, but that's fine. I would I would encourage people to pay attention to a writer named Michael Millerman, who is not a Christian, and so take what cautions you need from that, but is a bright philosophical observer, a good teacher, and somebody who I would consider the kind of person who's trying to walk hand in hand, doing a fundamental rethink of what we are as humans.
So our very first question of the evening, it was asked before the lecture even started, is the very concept of Christian political dissent unbiblical in that it either fosters a spirit of unsubmissiveness or actively encourages rebellion against what Scripture describes as God-established authority? Could you speak to the pastor or leader who tends to shy away from the messages of Dreher or the warnings of Soviet dissidents because they feel it is either too revolutionary or not applicable as they seek to bring the gospel to their congregations.
Yeah. I can't actually find that one in the, I'm trying to read them as you're going over it. Do you know where it is in this, or who wrote it?
It was the very first one. Try looking in the answered
Oh,
column.
got it. Okay. Is the concept of Christian political dissident unbiblical? I'm not the best person to ask about, the need for a spirit of submissiveness. So maybe, again, this might not be the right question for me to wrestle with. I do not. Here's what I would say. It seems to me like nothing I said tonight, necessitates in the lecture itself, necessitates or advocates violence or outright overthrow or any sort of revolutionary action. And furthermore, we have a long practice in the West as Christians thinking through how to disagree publicly with people who are in power. And it seems as if figuring out how to do that and how to politically advocate and organize for the interests of the church, and actually to have the church organize and advocate for the interests of all humans in the world to the best of their abilities, is a necessary extension of thinking about what it means for any Christian to have any amount of political power. So as soon as you have decided that the church is going to do anything in the world, you have already at least partially settled the question for yourself. I know that this does not address your maybe a problem that you have about kind of like, well, what about when the chief magistrate says stop doing it or something along those lines? But that's just not where we are, at the moment. So that would be the answer that I have.
Matt asks, this is third from the bottom in the open column, how can the Soviet dissidents address the advances in technology typically associated with the transhumanist movement? How does the idea of a Soviet man or societal transhumanism via totalitarianism interact with the technological transhumanism of the avatars of the Neal Stephenson-inspired future? I don't know who Neal Stephenson is. So
I don't know who Neal Stephenson is either, but I love the question. The Soviet Union, we think of it as being so retrograde and grungy and dirty, and everything was gross. But they were the party of science. There's a reason why so many Americans were members of the Communist Party in the 1900s. There's a reason why huge numbers of elite educated people in the West were members of communist parties, whether they were Trotskyite or some other version. Why is that? Because they had a political science. They had the science of politics down, and they were going to remake society on scientific, rational grounds. As Solzhenitsyn notes, that they knew they wanted the technology to accomplish these things. They simply didn't have it yet. So I would say that the theorizing, which you see in, you don't see it as much in Rousseau, but it's there when you get to Hegel and Marx and other thinkers. Solzhenitsyn is aware of it. Lewis is aware of it. Havel and Milosz are aware of it, that there's a goal here to, and maybe one of the hangups, there's a goal here to transform humanity using science as a means. There's probably a hang-up here for some listeners, because when we talk about technology, you think of the way we're talking right now, or my phone or something like that. But what we mean is techne, the ability to do, to make, to change. And so, what the Soviet Union was hoping was through techne to change humanity, to remake humanity in the way that it wanted humanity to be, to cut us new from whole cloth. And so, the technological transhumanism, which we're thinking of now, I don't think of as being fundamentally that different. Both sides think that they're going to remake humanity through technical means, and the goal being to transcend what we mean currently by the term human, and we will solve one or several or all of the problems which are currently inherent in being human, as opposed to the traditional approach, which is to say that part of being human is to recognize that you have these problems, and find ways to live with, resolve the internal contradictions and conundrums, which are the hem and haw of human life.
There are 3 questions, all right in a row, that are asking what Christians can do to avoid government surveillance. So I'll ask one. What role do study centers play in the current culture? Do you think this is a viable option for creating a network of Christians that will pass under the eye of the government? I ask since Davenant has its own study center.
Yeah. No, I would say that the kinds of networks which are going to pop up and are currently being created are going to look sometimes like very traditional organizations, and so things which resemble something like a monastery. But then there will also be very high-tech solutions which attempt to do the same sort of resolving the problem of being watched, the problem of having a space where you can actually communicate something on your own.
Do you want to show Lucy your desk?
No, I don't want to show Lucy my desk yet. I'm in the middle of a lecture. I'm still going. In 10 minutes. Get out of here. All right.
Okay, nobody will be watching.
All right. So some of the means are going to be very traditional, like what Solzhenitsyn and other dissidents did, which is identifying a place where you can be relatively sure that you're not being watched, and finding just a space to talk. And again, I want to clarify here for the people who are worried that, like, wait, is this are we trying to overthrow the government? No, that's not why you want a space not to be watched. You want a space not to be watched because human rationality requires it. It is hard, for example, to give this lecture right now, knowing not just that there's, however many people who are watching me, but that it's going to go online and it's going to live on YouTube, possibly forever. Who knows where it's going to go? Who knows who's going to chop it up to make me say what sort of horrible thing and put it somewhere. And, the probable reality is no one will watch it, no one will chop it up, and I'll be ignored, right? And that's the kind of the ultimate fear of anyone who posts anything online, is that actually no one's going to pay attention to me. And then the countervailing fear is everyone's going to see it, and then they'll all know what I think, and I'll be canceled. And both of those things are kind of holding all the time. So the point of finding these private spaces, finding these private means of communication, is not like revolutionary overthrow of the government, though the government's afraid of that, of course, and the more tyrannical a government is, the more it fears that. But the actual goal is simply that there needs to be space for me to gather with my friends and to discuss reality as I understand it. And any totalitarian government won't want that space to exist, because the totalitarian government requires that it have the capacity to intrude upon my every thought and action so that it can change them and conform them to its vision for my life. So there will be some spaces which I think will be very traditional, a meeting spot in the woods, a church building which we feel is safe, a friend's house. And I think this is already happening. When I talk to my students, everyone feels watched. Everyone feels watched. Friendship is like at an all-time low. everyone's freaked out about everyone else. Everyone's afraid somebody else is going to rat on them, take a picture of them and post it online. It's going to go viral. And so we're already trying to find and build these spaces naturally because we naturally long for it. It's just part of who we are as people, as embodied rational beings. And then, of course, I think there will be, and we're starting to begin to see genuine high-tech options and alternatives, which will help us to find ways to communicate with one another and store information and transmit information, which are not being watched by the corporations or the app developers or the government or whatever. And that technology will advance and get better as time goes on.
Well, we've probably got time for one, maybe two more questions. So, Colin, do you want a practical question or a historical question?
Whatever, man. Let's
All right,
roll the
let's
dice.
see. What would you say to parents of young children today seeking to raise up children to have a strong faith and resist a redefinition of what it means to be human? What do you do with your kids?
Yeah. I would say you want to keep them in a community of people who are going to engage with them and transmit the ways of being human that you have known. So whether that's extended family, relatives, church networks. One of the things that I know Alistair Roberts talks about, who's also a fellow at the Davenant Institute, I'm sure you're familiar with him. He'll talk about how there's a real danger once you've kind of confronted some of these realities in retreating into a highly insular network. And actually, I would say for me at the moment, that's a real fear, because when the pandemic hit, my normal engagement where, we'd go to church and our kids are going to Sunday school, and then, they'd go to their school, and we try to have a sense in which we want to engage with the rest of the world. We're not trying to be, hunkered down in our bunker or something like that. Because you need to have this kind of capacious, expansive interest in everything outside of yourself, right? I mean, it's not human to kind of be paranoid all the time. And so, you choose those communities and relationships judiciously. But of course, during the pandemic, one of the things that happened is suddenly you kind of retreat into the smallest formation of your immediate family that you can. And, so there was like months where I think the only people that my kids saw, I'm just really grateful my family lives my extended family lives in the area. Like the only people they saw were my brother and his kids and his wife and my parents. And that's good, because those people are really good to have in my kids' lives. It's also not enough. They need to grow up knowing that there are other people out there and learning how to engage with them. So I just think like modeling what it is to live in a bigger society is helpful, and then teaching them scripture. There's nothing I've said tonight which scripture does not teach, to the best of my knowledge. There's some stuff in here I've been quoting from some other people, but I've been trying to speak about the truth, which scripture would be in accordance with. So. I just think I can't advocate reading scripture with your kids and just talking about life, the universe, and everything enough.
4 minutes. Do you want to do one more?
Yeah, let's do one more. I got 4 minutes.
Okay. This is in response to the question that I asked you before that one about the private spaces. So then what do you say about the current agendas of various interest groups that want to cancel safe spaces and cancel culture? Is there a way Christians should be resisting the concept of cancel culture, or do we just have to accept it and find private safe spaces to speak to one another?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. It's a good question. My response would be that we need to place cancel culture, whatever we mean by cancel culture, inside of a much larger perspective. So like, why is cancel culture possible? Cancel culture is possible because we have an absolutely overwhelmed and oversaturated marketplace of labor. And in an internet land where There's a dozen people who are waiting to write, blog posts for the blog that you write for as a blogger. You are cancelable. If you say something and a mob comes after you, they can get rid of you because there's somebody else just like you out there who they can kind of swap you in with. So I think we can get narrowly focused on, the cancel culture, and we got to resist the cancel culture, fight the war or whatever. And or we don't fight the war, we just retreat and be in our safe spaces. And I want to reframe it and say, no, the point of something like the Davenant House, where you're like, okay, this is a place where I can like genuinely think and talk to people, and I'm not being watched, and it's not going on YouTube, and it's not going on Twitter. The value of that is intrinsic. It's not like we have to do it in response to something that's going on in the culture. It's quite strange that we think of something like the Davenant House or some place like that as like a weird phenomenon. Because remember, for most of human history, right, feeling comfortable talking to your pastor at church, and as if it's not going to get out on Twitter, was the norm. That's the norm. What's weird is being afraid all the time somebody's going to take a picture of you and it's going to go viral online. That's the strange thing. And so living in a global marketplace with a digital surround where everything is remembered forever is creating some extremely strange phenomenon. And we don't win those, as a church by simply taking political action and, owning the libs or whatever. Rather, I really want to advocate for engaging in fundamental philosophical rediscovery about the nature of what it is to be human, and teaching folks what and why it would be worth dying, why it would be worth God dying for us. Why would God embrace that? Why would he become a human? I think if we go that route, we can start seeing those other aspects of cancel culture that we don't currently see. And so, for example, we think of ourselves as laborers in a marketplace of labor. We think of ourselves as, a community of people who are striving for status with a limited number of status jobs. You start seeing cancel culture in a new light, right? Like maybe cancel culture is a way of, maybe it's actually about intra-elite rivalry is one of the things that I would say. It's not like, somebody living in, rural Arkansas actually needs to be that worried about being canceled. Rather, you need to be worried about being canceled if you're a journalist, right? Why, isn't that weird that the people who are most, public and have these status jobs are the ones who get canceled? Why is it? Because we don't have enough status jobs. The number of status jobs relative to the population who could possibly do those status jobs has changed. It's fundamentally changed. And so anyway, things like that.
Okay. Well, on that note, we're all out of time. It's 9:30 on the East Coast. So thank you everyone for coming. We hope you enjoyed this. We hope that this will inspire you to.
And I'll just add one thing for any of the YouTube people or anybody who's still out there. We are currently doing a fund drive for Davenant House, which is matching. And so if you have some means to give some money for the Davenant House to be able to expand its property, please do make a gift. And we're going to put that in the show notes for everybody who's online. And if you're online and it's in the future and we've already made or failed to make that matching gift, please do give. The only way we can make this work at the Davenant Institute to be able to offer these lectures and provide this teaching is by the donations of good folks just like yourselves.